Before we actually go out and perform the test of controls, we need to document all the different transaction level controls we identified during the risk assessment stage of the audit. So there's a number of different forms of documentation or ways that auditors can document these transaction level controls. We're going to take a brief look at each of these. The first one is narrative form, which is basically kind of a short vignette story about what the auditor found when they looked at controls. So this is looking at controls at a very detailed level, the different aspects of each particular control. Oftentimes, especially when we're talking about controls dealing with information technology, auditors will use flowcharts or logic diagrams to get a feel for how information flows throughout the system. And sometimes you actually see a combination of these approaches where you'll have a narrative and a flowchart kind of intermixed. And also auditors rely upon pre-formatted questionnaires or checklists, basically checking off to make sure different steps within the process were completed and kind of documenting who actually completes those different processes. So let's look first off at a narrative. Remember we had an example earlier of the sales function and internal control surrounding the sales function. One of the very first parts of the sales function is actually making the decision on whether we're going to allow the sale. So what we see here is a narrative created by the auditor, basically just a write-up of what they found when they investigated this part of the sales function. So this is just a write-up of everything they've seen. Notice we start at the very beginning that a sales order was received from a potential customer. Then we look and make sure that customer is on the master file. If not, we have to contact the credit department or the person in charge of the sales process, the sales department, to see if we could allow this customer to be granted credit. So there's a whole process that we're going through. I won't read through the entire write-up, but I just want you to understand this is one way that auditors go about documenting what they see when they're gaining this understanding of internal control. So notice what we're seeing right here in narrative form. We could document it in a different way. We have the same kind of documentation here, same process being documented, but it's kind of a logic diagram flowchart format. Notice it's starting with that first step, sales order has been received. All right, so we're going to try to figure out, well, is this an approved customer? No. If not, we're going to go and talk to the sales manager, see if we want this to be somebody that we're going to sell something to. If they are an approved customer, then we want to check out if they have enough credit to actually purchase the goods from us. If yes, we kind of just go down and process the order. If not, we go and look at all the different steps that need to be taken to handle the situation. Maybe they'll be granted additional credit, maybe they won't, but this documentation shows us the process that's followed by this company in their internal control over the sales process. Now, we can see here, you could actually have a combination of the two approaches. So this is basically just taking the last two examples and combining them together. So on the left-hand side, we just reproduce the flow chart for the sales process. And next to it, we have like little dotted lines here that show the narrative that's associated with each part of the process. And the last form of documentation is the checklist. So this is just a different way that the auditor can document their understanding of internal control. Notice different steps in the process are kind of outlined. So an auditor might have experience from this client in the past or other similar clients of what typically should be expected as part of the internal control process for sales. And they kind of have a list of the typical steps, and then they just check off who performed it. And then they talk about whether they relied on electronic data or if it was done manually. So these are just different ways to go about documenting internal control based on the CPA firm you're working at. They'll have maybe their preferred method. Maybe they use different forms of documentation based on the various functions functions they find within a particular client, or maybe they change their form of documentation amongst their various clients. So again, a lot of this documentation is left up to the auditor's discretion, but it's really, really key, regardless of what form of documentation that we have, we need to have documentation on hand. We really want to protect ourselves against legal liability, and we want to have proof that we actually followed the auditing standards appropriately and effectively.